Charlie, thank you ever so much for joining me on the International Classroom podcast. Whereabouts do we find you in the world today?
It's a pleasure to join you, Alex. Thank you. At the moment, I'm in the UK, up in North Yorkshire where I live, and that's where I spend most of my time, just with the occasional trip out and about to different schools, different countries, whenever I can, fundamentally. Yeah.
It's very blasé. Yeah, whenever I can get out of the country and go visit some other schools. Well, that leads us on to nicely then. How would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners today?
Well, I guess some of the important things to understand about my own educational experiences are that I have worked exclusively in the UK, fundamentally. So that's where I've always worked in UK schools, particularly the boarding school sector. But from the very beginning of my time in education, I've worked really quite extensively with schools and universities on all 6 continents. Initially, that started very much with a sort of teaching and learning angle, but increasingly that pastoral character education, looking at all aspects of education, really understanding each individual child uniquely and their strengths has become my focal point. So I spend my time really doing a lot of different projects, working directly with some schools. So I'll talk about some of the schools in Japan that I work directly with. Sometimes doing a little bit of coaching for individual students. So not just about normal kind of university preparation, but really looking at all aspects of their life and how they can plan their education beyond just the school that they're in and various life experiences. I've started doing a lot of programs for parents as well in different parts of the world to help them understand adolescent development. So my sort of daily life is very different. I help schools at the moment invest in UK schools, particularly like Chinese schools start looking at the UK sector. Really quite varied. So yeah, different things.
But you're well versed then to talk about what we want to today, which is this mini series that takes place on global perspectives in education, and we're having this conversation obviously off air about the ability and the nice thing about being able to have a look through different lenses at what different countries do. And specifically today, we want to talk about sort of what goes on in the Japanese education system. But how did you find yourself sort of working with Japan and the Japanese education system?
So Japan actually was my starting point. Back in 2002, I was still a student at school. I was just moving into year 13, and I started working on a Japanese summer program that my school ran. I was just an assistant. And I knew I wanted to go into education. I was already committed to a sort of career in education. So I just started really talking to the Japanese teachers as much as I could about what school education was like in Japan. And my interest just continued to grow. So when I was at university, I continued going back to work on the summer schools. I eventually led that summer program. And I just read extensively on the history of education in Japan. I visited a number of schools. I spoke to education journalists, nurtured sort of connections with teachers, school leaders. I went out and gave various talks in Japan, worked with parent groups. So even though I never sort of like worked directly with a Japanese school, from a really early stage in my career, I was always comparing and contrasting what I was experiencing in the UK with what I was learning about Japan. And that's where my interest in sort of international comparison started as well, I think. So, I think I love to connect and synthesize global education. I really sort of like to understand those unique qualities of different education systems, not because I'm always thinking the grass is greener, but because I like to understand the context in which different decisions are made, because I think that really helps develop me as a decision maker. And I've also realized, particularly in Japan, there is now this huge call for a lot more help and support with character education, holistic impact education, all the things that I care deeply about. And therefore there is this kind of just a really interesting space in which to try and work with teachers towards changing and transforming an education system that is very traditional, that is very much the epitome of an oil tanker needing turning, but whilst it's still being held down by loads and loads of tugboats all around it. I mean, there's like so much inertia within the system, and that's a challenge that really excites me. So yeah, that's my kind of potted history of my time with Japanese education. and why I continue to be like so interested in it.
So the first question I'd probably take from listening to you there is, well, how does it compare? How are you finding it in comparison to all the different countries you get to visit?
I think there are some very strong similarities, first of all. I think when I speak with Japanese teachers, they have a very different perception of what UK education is, what US education is. And they think that they are very different. And they really aspire, certainly the top schools really aspire to what they see and what they perceive in the West. But I see a lot more similarities. I think that the impact that university entrance requirements has the whole way down an education system is extremely powerful, for good and for bad. So I look at elements of the US university entrance system and I love it because it focuses on personal development, personal narrative. It's not quite so sort of focused in on the academic criteria we see in other places. And yet when I speak with American colleagues, they have criticisms of that. Strengths always become weaknesses. And so I think in Japan, that strong entrance, university entrance test culture has a significant impact the whole way down the system. That has lots of strengths. They've got a very rigorous curriculum, very good with elements of knowledge and content. The students are extremely diligent. I think there's a lot you can learn from Japanese students in terms of how they take responsibility for their learning, how they go and seek feedback and advice from teachers in a way that you don't always see in other countries. So simply for that, you can't really imagine in the UK a student just walking into the staff room, going straight up to a teacher's desk and being able to sit down and have a discussion straight away with them because the student wants it there and then. But in Japan, that's commonplace. So there are certain elements that are sort of similarities that then have this slightly Japanese flavour to them. There's a lot of emphasis on, collective learning, working together. But again, that group work just has this very subtle difference in terms of how it plays out, the kind of the outcomes that it leads to. And I'll certainly talk about that a lot more as we go through this, because I think it's a sort of very common theme throughout much of the discussion we'll have on moral education. So yeah, there's these kind of similarities in what they're trying to achieve with these subtle differences in terms of how that then is implemented. And one of the big challenges a lot of schools in East Asia, actually, across much of sort of China, Korea, Japan, talk about is the large class sizes. And that builds a huge amount of inertia into the system. You have half the number of teachers roughly in a Japanese school compared to in a UK school the same size. So class sizes are much bigger, and that completely changes the dynamic. It completely changes what is possible and how you navigate change and how you sort of personalize and provide feedback to students. So that leads to some quite significant differences.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because on my research, when I became interested with sort of what Japan was doing was, as you mentioned, about obviously this compulsory moral education that I believe came in 2018. But obviously from what you're saying, there's this academic rigor and almost drive for university entrance, for university places. And I imagine those are global universities as well, not just necessarily within the homegrown field. But just focusing then on moral education, is it built in? Is there a framework there that is structured into the curriculum of Japanese schools?
Yes, it's worth saying, as you said, the moral education curriculum was kind of formalised and you might say reintroduced, or maybe the agenda was accelerated in 2018. But actually it goes back to around about 1873 in Japan. And certainly between sort of 1880 to the end of the war, 1945, moral education almost became one of the highest subjects in terms of its kind of level of importance. Then it had a little bit of a decline really in terms of how it was seen, how it was valued, because it had this very pro-nationalist approach in the sort of the decade prior to the war. And Japan's own history, post-war history, meant it was very uncomfortable with that. So there wasn't that same level of attention and rigour given by the government towards stipulating what should be covered and how it should be covered in moral education. And then the much more conservative government that was sort of feeling a little bit more empowered, a little bit more of a revisionist history, if you like, of Japan's kind of pre-war and wartime history, felt empowered to try and push that agenda again and to create a framework. So the framework fundamentally is about this aim towards encouraging, responsible behavior in society. And I choose that phrase deliberately because you'll see that in pretty much every single country's education system. They will all have some aspect which is about citizenship. It is about, in the UK, we have it through British values. We have it in part of our PSHE curriculum. We've had citizenship introduced. That whole idea about schools are not just about providing a kind of an academic path into the workplace, but are also preparing citizens of the future. And so even though there's some slight variations in the exact language that Japan uses for that, that's fundamentally the aim. And then there are these 4 themes that are then used to help deliver that framework. And those themes, they start off with self, then it moves towards other expands up towards society, and then there's, interestingly, in the environment too. And I say interestingly the environment too because I think in many countries that's quite a recent addition to curriculum, to really specify the environment, either due to sustainability agenda, climate change, all of those things. Whereas the environment in Japan and moral education around the environment for Japan is really heavily based in its long-term traditions, cultures, the way in which it sees the role of people and society within a broader environment and that relationship with nature. So that's something which I think if we were designing the same kind of moral education program in a country like the UK or the US, I don't think we would have environment in it the way that the Japanese moral education framework thinks about the environment. So I think that's something that's a little bit different, but it's basically it's a once a week 1 hour lesson. It's supposed to be very discussion based. Students are supposed to work in groups. They are supposed to think about ethical issues and particularly ethical decisions, and they're supposed to be reflecting upon their own actions and behaviors in real life situations using those kind of stories, ethical stories. Fables is probably a right kind of word to use to describe much of what the stories in the textbook are actually doing.
I think I have a book on my shelf. It's called The Magic of Metaphor. It's probably very, very similar to that. It goes through these metaphorical stories. I love that book, by the way. It's great. I'm going to just really focus in on something because you use the word supposed.
Yeah,
a lot there.
Yeah,
and is that the same then as probably most education systems where there's these types of things that we are supposed to do, and actually probably don't get done as much as they should?
So there's been some research which has looking at the policy of moral education and what it's supposed to do, and researching what all of that means. Strengths, weaknesses, etc., because it's quite contentious as a policy actually. So there's a lot of research that focuses on the policy, and then there's a body of research that focuses on practice, and the two don't necessarily align particularly well. So there's quite a big disconnect really between what actually is supposed to happen and what actually happens. So we can unpack that a little bit. First of all, do schools spend the time on it? Yes, fundamentally. The schools they put it into their homeroom teaching time. So it's different from, Japan's got a secular education. So we don't have the religious education you have in the UK where you then have a set religious teacher or humanities teacher, where you have assessed curriculum. So the moral education is not assessed. It's not taught by specialists. It's really delivered by the homeroom teachers. So that in itself brings a lot of problems in terms of implementation, because Japan anyway is quite localized in terms of how it implements education policy. And then the individual teachers, the homeroom teachers, also have a lot of freedom in terms of what they do. So some teachers just don't agree with some of the stories that are in the government-provided textbook, so they tend not to focus too much on those. So that's one element of where practice kind of differs. Another area it differs is, I said about supposed to be discussion-based. Group work is very different, in my experience, in Japanese schools compared to schools that follow a more Western, discursive, collaborative model of education. Yes, if you go into a Japanese school, really of any age, except for senior high 3, where there's virtually no discussion because it is just university entrance exam, individual work. But up to that point, you can go into pretty much any class and you probably will see evidence of some kind of group activity. So it's not that it's just kept to these sessions. It is something that is very present in Japanese education. But what makes it so different is the sort of the content-rich nature of Japanese education means there's very little time. So the teacher might say, right, a 30-second timer is going on the board. Person A needs to present their opinion. 30 seconds countdown. Right, person B now needs to give their opinion for 30 seconds. 30 seconds counts down. Person C now needs to. It's very much delivered like that. And the other thing that has a massive impact on the outcomes of group work, and I think the kind of the outcomes of moral education in Japan, are that students do not feel comfortable to go beyond what they think others expect of them. What I mean by that is you don't share a contentious opinion. You want to be seen to kind of conform and to go with what the group is comfortable with. You want to make other students feel comfortable. You don't want to stand out. That's culturally something that's very difficult for a student to do. So when I bring Japanese students over to the UK for our summer programs, I still run them. I've set some up with individual schools. That's one of our biggest challenges, is actually taking the time to get students to say what they really think and to be able to form their own opinions and to then articulate those opinions in front of others. And so that has massive implications. If you're going to have ethical decisions, you need children to sort of be comfortable pushing the boundaries of those. Whereas what's happened is you now have this government written textbook, or government authorized textbook, I should say. They kind of edited many of the stories that are used within the main textbooks. That's going forward. The questions that are within the textbook are very leading questions. You don't need to read the passage to know what the answer to the question is. It's the kind of the obvious thing you would do. Yeah. But that means as a student, you don't challenge it. You don't really think about it. And that's where a lot of the top schools are getting frustrated by the framework, what is happening in moral education, and how limited teacher training is on effective group work. So that facilitating effective group work, as you know, is actually really challenging. And there hasn't been a huge amount of training that's been done. So teachers aren't comfortable with it. The classes, you might have 45, 50 students in a class. If you've got 10, 11 different groups working, how can you listen in to all their conversations? How can you provide feedback? How can you then get them to effectively share what they've been discussing? You just don't have the time. So that's where I mean this kind of, supposed to, all of these kinds of things. There's this big difference between what I think they would love to see happen and what can actually happen within the current culture and the current teacher training, the current, fixed physical environment, large class sizes.
Well, for me, I suppose I'm thinking quite fast about this in terms of if I had a large class size like that, then it would be easier to put them into group work and make it group orientated, because then you could probably get so much more done and you then become a facilitator of learning rather than that traditional sage on the stage. But what I'm gathering from you isn't necessarily quite like that. And it's interesting because, again, looking at different countries and researching, a lot of the things that are finding and coming out of this is that Japan's education system is holistic. It's about holistic development. It's about, group orientated learning. But it isn't necessarily, or at least for moral education, it isn't the case. Do you also see that across other subjects? If I was teaching biology, which so from my side being a scientist, or is there the occasional teacher that does and can bring these skill sets in? Or do you think then that the lack of, let's say, pedagogical experience in doing this stems back to teacher professional development?
That's a really good question. And my sense is very much that moral education is designed to promote traditional Japanese values and culture, etc. And so it's trying to reinforce existing ways and existing relationships between people of different ages, people of different positions. It's almost like reinforcing all of that. But that is also why you won't see many Japanese teachers being comfortable with the idea of being a facilitator. So there are these big cultural circumstances that I think limit at the moment the ability to do that. So actually on that, we took a little experiment this summer with a summer program. So we have a school in Japan not happy with summer programs in the UK, asked me, could we just make up our own and could we run our own trip? So we had a sort of 2-week summer excursion for this school, 36 students. And we were up in Scotland where we started. The aim was to try and help them understand why the UK is like it is, so they can go back and reflect on why Japan is like it is, so they become better decision makers for Japan's future. Go and experience what migration really feels like if you go and walk around somewhere like Brick Lane in London, so you can then make decisions about what Japan needs in terms of migration for its aging workforce, etc., etc. So we started up in Scotland so they could understand the different countries of the UK, the history of independence, and all that sort of stuff. And we were staying at Stirling University right underneath the National Wallace Monument. There's an enormous great tower for William Wallace, the sort of great Scottish hero. And inside they've got busts of various really important poets, scientists from Scotland's history. And we said to the students, right, we want you to sort of think about what would be your equivalent in Japan. Who are the people and who would you most name it after and all that kind of stuff. But what we did is we said, right, we're going to set this up in group work. But we're now going to have each of the Japanese teachers who was with us sort of supervising that group. And we knew they had very strong opinions on which particular Japanese people should be celebrated, because they'd already sort of got excited about this project because they thought, it's a great opportunity for us to tell the students about this person and that person. That's their first instinct. We can tell them about this. And we said to them, right, the conditions are you're not allowed to speak. You have to sit in silence and you have to listen to what your students are saying. And there was then a period of time where they could then ask certain questions. You had to then ask them certain questions to guide them towards things. You couldn't just say what you thought. One of the teachers succeeded for about 25% of the time and then went straight into telling them everything. The other three, I've never seen 3 people looking so uncomfortable, because they want to be there. There is this, it is content heavy, the whole curriculum. Everything is about, imparting knowledge, sharing knowledge, delivering knowledge. And so it's really difficult to then help people understand what it means to be a facilitator, how to be a facilitator, to be brave enough to take that, because your students aren't ready for you to do that. So for us in the UK, I do a 2-month preparation course with these students before they come, helping to try and shift the mindset, shift the narrative in terms of what our expectations are. You will speak before we do. You will share your observations of what you're seeing in different places before we start engaging with you. And that's going to be a big challenge for education in Japan. That's not going to change easily. So I look at big class sizes and I can see solutions to the problem. But then when I've gone out and delivered programs in Japan and I've set things up in groups, I'm comfortable in that environment. I'm also setting up my own curriculum. I'm removing a lot of content. I'm making it much more focused on what the students bring forwards first of all, and I'm responding to them. Whereas that would be really difficult for a teacher to do in Japan.
Yeah. And again, obviously, it's a very much a cultural thing, like you're highlighting there. Yeah. So let's flip that. I want to flip it on its head, because obviously, there's things you've talked about. We're not here to kind of put it in a downward light, but there are issues in every education system, in every platform. We know there are things that we want to do better. And obviously, that's one of the reasons why you spend so much time out in Japan, and why I think as an education system, they recognize that, we want to do this better. So I'm really curious about the types of things, because you've alluded to some of it that you're doing. What are the types of things that you are bringing over there? What are the types of things that you are, as say, designing and implementing and pushing them with?
There's quite a range of things, really. So the main group I work with is a sort of consortium of 8 schools that have come together, top academics or performing schools, high entrance tests, send them off to top universities. And they want to lead change in education, and they've come together as a consortium around this notion of double helix. The idea that double helix, you have these 2 strands, you have knowledge and you have skills, and that they spiral and they're connected, and that there is this relationship between knowledge and skills development. And they want to help raise awareness of that within the students as a sort of a key step towards developing more independently minded and more independent learners. So a lot of my work is around developing independent learners, and that then leads into elements of personal development and character education. So I have programs where I help students look at all 10 areas of their life and really start to make decisions about their future, what their beliefs are, what their vision is, what their motivations are, what the action steps they need to get there, and help them with kind of 5-year goal setting, really. And how do you then take goals down towards action? So reflection and goal setting are part of the Japanese moral education sort of curriculum. That's what the government is after. And when I do questionnaires for students before some of these programs, many of them say, I regularly reflect, I regularly set goals. It's not reflection as you and I would know it. It's not goal setting as you and I would know it. So it's sort of helping them understand actually what deep reflection really is, what goal setting really is. How do you sort of really reflect in on yourself, understand what you offer the world? How do you understand what the world needs from you, and how do those two align? And that's where your sort of action should be. So they're sort of really important areas, I guess, for what people in Japan are asking for. Interestingly, actually, the area that's just come up in the last few weeks, where a lot of education journalists are wanting to kind of talk a lot more directly about, is well-being. And again, this is often seen as, for me, holistic impact education cannot exist without well-being being like an absolutely central core component of it. In Japan, they talk about holistic education, but well-being is something that is just completely new to the system. Parents are starting to ask a lot more about it, really concerned about their teenage children and the pressures they're facing. Bullying culture is a major problem. Peer pressure, social media, all of these things are really affecting well-being amongst children. I've got a parent who's on one of my parent programs, she's actually a sort of specialist in eating disorders. But she says, I've never really had to do much from a teenager's perspective. Are we actually seeing this in the schools? And we're like, yes, look at the evidence. It's kind of like it's really clear there in the schools in Japan. So there's this kind of disconnect even between the sort of professional services in the country and schools. And so, there's so many areas where they're looking for that kindness in education, where they're looking for students who are not just going through the motions, but actually have some intrinsic motivation. That's a crucial area. You talk to any student, and it's just like, well, the reason I have to do this is because I've got this test coming up, because I've got this entrance exam coming up, because I've been put into cram school by my parents, because I've got this. It's just extrinsic motivation, left, right, and centre. And many of those children say to me, that the online programs I do with them are their first opportunity to talk, their first opportunity to share what they actually want, what they think about themselves. And they want help going and talking to their parents about why they want to make this choice for university, why they want to do this club, not that club, and that's sort of a challenge they face. So, parent education is a massive one. It's not because the parents don't want that environment and that life for their children. It's that they just don't know. They're in a system that is, why would you take a risk in a system where if you miss out on that university entrance exam, that's going to affect your first job potentially, because the careers, workforce is all looking at your university, more than your broader CV. So yeah, there's a whole range of challenges. There's also some incredible strengths within the system. I don't want to be deep sort of presenting it as kind of, they're crying out for help because they can't do things. I think one of the great strengths actually is that openness towards other ways of thinking, that openness to there must be some other ways of doing this. That's a real strength that I'm seeing increasingly actually. It's just getting some of those people to come out and put their heads above the parapet, because that's quite a scary situation. But once one or two do in a school, it's amazing how many other teachers step forward and say, yeah, actually, I want to see that change. That's what I want as well. So it's just giving people a voice.
It's so interesting you say that, because obviously when you talk about these strengths, what I see from someone outside of Japan now is a lot of institutions, and I'm actually an individual who does this as well, but picking up sort of Japanese sayings or philosophies. So prime example, there is the book, isn't there, the Ikigai.
Yeah.
And I know someone who's gone off and set up this amazing school in Mexico, Colegio Ikigai, based on what he's seen. Obviously, he's taken the Finnish phenomenon-based learning as well, but he's taken these principles from Japan. And for me, I read the New Zealand All Black Legacy book, which is really, really good. These 15 strategies. And one of them in there was about Kaizen.
Yeah.
And that's really, really stuck with me. So I find it so interesting that you've got these external educators and individuals from Japan who are taking like the philosophical approaches and the ideas that the Japan way has and making something of it. Yet what it seems to be is that inside Japan, they're kind of struggling with the identity a little bit, struggling with the types of things they want, or, I would look at it and go, actually, it's maybe are they 10 years behind us? Are they 5 years behind us? And questioning that sort of that why. So when well-being comes up, and it's like, actually, it's something now that you can't go to any school, any international school, probably UK school, without something being there. It's great to hear, but in terms of they're onto it. But then you question, but why? You have all these things from an external point of view. I see all this thing is what do you want to keep and what do you want to change for better? That for me is Kaizen. And it's like, surely they would have, but obviously tradition and culture plays a huge part in that, doesn't it?
Massively. And I mean, Kaizen is an interesting one anyway. I mean, it's because for that same reason, the philosophy in the UK of Kaizen was really sort of Nissan is famous as a manufacturing plant not far from where I am here, actually, which kind of implemented Kaizen and then sort of extolled its virtues in the rest of the UK. And the Nissan plant in Washington, near Sunderland, is the most productive, most efficient car plant in the world. So actually, a Japanese car manufacturer can be more efficient outside of Japan than in Japan, which doesn't really make sense if you think about it. It should be more sort of challenging working in a different culture. I think when I'm at my sort of most frustrated, if you like, working in different things, because the bureaucracy is heavy in Japan. You want to get change, well, you've got to go and take it to a teacher's meeting. You can have any teacher in the school can basically sort of stand up and say, no, I don't think we should have that. And that means we're back to square one in terms of discussing it and getting everybody to agree with it. So when I'm at my most frustrated, I kind of look at things like that, Ikigai, and you think, in the West, we take a really complicated and complex idea, and we're very good at simplifying it instantly and then saying, right, I've got it, I run with it. Japan is very good at taking a really simple idea and making it more and more complex to the point that you can't then move forward with it. It's like an unfair. That's a sort of, when sometimes you're working in different cultural environments. I find exactly the same when I work with very traditional schools in the UK. I'm often quite countercultural, want to sort of push things forward, have change. And I see schools in the UK, being that little bit slower to sort of to think about that change. So when I get frustrated, I think about that idea and actually how we see Ikigai in the UK and the US is really simplified compared with if you actually get into a deep philosophical discussion with somebody who really knows about Ikigai in Japan. And in Japan, they really value mastery. Like, you know, we know from their craftsmanship and all the rest, they don't like quick learning. You know, if you want to slice fish, you've got to study sushi for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, you know? Whereas, you know, anybody in the UK can do sushi. I can make sushi with my son. That's not sushi really if you're in Japan. You know, it's this different way of looking at things. And I really admire that in so many ways. That pursuit of excellence is something you see like across the whole system. So when a decision's made, if you're going to try something, if we're going to do something, you know it's going to be pretty effective, I think, in Japan. You don't get that many, well, we'll give it a go and then, oh, we're stuck into that system and we kind of run it. It's very good from that perspective, but that is a big difference, and it goes back to I mentioned earlier about like the importance of the environment in moral education. So, have you ever been to Japan, Alex, or not?
No, it's on my bucket list of places that I want to go to.
It is phenomenal, but you'll be familiar with Japanese food because that's now become global. So, before people eat in Japan, they say itadakimasu, and I've heard that for years and years. And I always thought it was quite similar to how we might say grace in the UK. It's a kind of, a sort of a being grateful for. And actually, when it was first translated for me, that was reinforced. It's kind of translates roughly as I receive humbly or I humbly receive. It's kind of words to that effect. And I thought no more than that. I just thought that's what it was. And it was only recently that my closest friend in Japan actually kind of sat me down and talked to me about what it really means. And it is this gratitude and this recognition that another living thing has had to give up its life so that you may live. So they see animals and plants as being the same, in terms of living. So, for many people who are very Japanese, veganism is a difficult concept because, well, you're still having to consume and therefore kill something that was once living in a plant. They don't see that distinction. And they don't want to, that helps you understand why people in Japan don't want to take more from their environment than they have to, why they're, very careful with the amount of food that is consumed, why they think in certain ways. And so understanding some of those concepts that we just kind of grab and buy by the bookload in terms of 10 chapters of 10 different Japanese concepts. Japanese people find it very difficult when they sort of hear our appropriation of some of their kind of important cultural concepts and traditions. But I think that's also one of the problems with moral education. In Japan, it's extremely complex. There's no simplicity to it. Everything has to be considered to such a high level that, covering it 1 hour a week from young age of kids, it's like lost on a lot of them. They're complicated stories.
I can imagine. I was trying to think it through in terms of what resonates with me there. Like having taught moral and social studies, having taught obviously ethics as well, going into that, it's almost like philosophical. And from a very young age. And there are some companies out there, and I've seen studies on it in terms of philosophical thinking and how you can bring those types of questions in. But like you're saying, if you're not allowing students the opportunity, or that's probably the wrong word, if students aren't comfortable in exploring the concepts in front of them and unpacking it and causing conflict, and not as in but a disagreement. And we would say, obviously, from a Western side, that conflict equals growth. Like sitting in a room, when you're in school, you don't want to have just a room full of yes people. You don't want to have everyone of the same opinion in an SLT group because you're never going to really get any good growth from that. And I imagine, like you say, with the complexities and the time frame and the fact that no one really wants to stand out from there, you're not challenging ideas, which I find as a camera geek, as a tech geek, and I'm sat here with Sonys and I've shot with Canons and all of the best technology that we see, and we say about cars, and even over here in the UAE, it's like, well, you go get a Japanese 7-year warranty, and that kind of Western mindset towards Japanese things in terms of high functioning, tech that's, really well thought through. Like you say previously, there just seems that disconnect. It seems like they're two different worlds, and it's interesting. But obviously, from your side, there's so much scope then for growth and development. It must be super exciting.
Well, that's actually what you mentioned there in terms of technology. It's like a really good way to help you understand Japanese education. So, as I said, back in 2002. Like we as like UK staff were just blown away by the technology the students used to bring with them. I mean, first like flip phones, taking photos on phones, then they could like video on phones. All these things were light years ahead of our bricks. And when I first went to visit a Japanese school, I was like, it was at the stage where I was just starting to teach, and technology was pretty important now in the classroom. We all had to have whiteboards and interactive whiteboards, etc. And I went there thinking, like, I'm going to see some incredible tech in these schools. I mean, their toilets are the most advanced in the world. They're incredible, and yet, it's just like you just expect it, don't you? And then I got there. I don't think there was even a need for plugs in the school. I mean, there was not a single piece of technology anywhere in this school. And this is a really like high performing school in Nagasaki. It was, basically sponsored by the local bank as well. So it had huge financial resources behind it. And there was no technology at all. Blackboards everywhere. You go into the staff room and it's just piled with paper because staff didn't have laptops. They didn't have anything to do that. The very start of COVID, I had a school in Japan phone me to ask about, learning management systems, LMS, in schools. And they basically said, are these things real? Are they actually, what do they do? And can they really be safe and secure? And I was like, yeah. I said, how do you manage it at the moment? And they said, well, actually, recently we've moved to putting all of our student information onto an Excel spreadsheet. And then that gets emailed around to all the teachers, and we then keep it on our laptops. And it means that I can sort of open this Excel spreadsheet and I can, find out anybody's address, or I can then find stuff about the students if I need to phone the parents. You think, great, as can anybody else who can access your laptop when you leave it on the Tokyo Underground. And you've suddenly got student data everywhere. And, like an Excel document, what is that? But they were sort of proud of that. And the head teacher, I mean, you look at school leadership in many schools, and, the head teachers have been in that position for a long period of time. They're often, certainly in the independent sector, they're quite often in their 80s. And therefore, that sort of same sense of technological advancement or moving with the times perhaps doesn't feel that same pressure. I actually think that's one of the strengths in their leadership systems as well. But that's kind of like strengths become weaknesses. Weaknesses can sometimes become strengths. Technology, mind blowing. You'll see a lot more now, but the way in which it's used is pretty sporadic.
Do you think that has an impact then on student attainment and the outcomes they get? Or is it a case of, look, no, these traditional methods that we've got and the way in which we learn, because we're talking like a lot of emphasis placed on university, like you've mentioned, and you've got a cost side of it, but you still have to pass. You still got to have the grades to get there. And so they must be doing something right or approaching it in a way that allows them to achieve this.
Well, that's the key, isn't it? So they've perfected hitting the bullseye of the target. Yeah. The problem is it the right target they're aiming for? And that's the key thing. So, in terms of like attainment, it's really hard to argue with that. I mean, students have phenomenal outcomes. So some of the schools will send their students, they'll do like a 3-month placement in Australia, Canada, UK, kind of join another school for a term, get some international experience. Those students that are year 11 will get put straight into a year 12 or year 13 A-level maths class and find it boring because they've done it. And if it's something they haven't done, they've grasped it in seconds. Science, light years ahead. So they are definitely doing things right. You can then argue, but I receive emails from students at 2:00 in the morning who are still working. the students the students have this pressure to do that. You can't fall behind in that system. You hear the same in many sort of parts of China. Any of these kind of systems where you've got large numbers of students applying for a small number of places, where it's just a straight, you need to get this score, and this score alone is what determines, the top 100 get this. It's incredibly competitive. Lots of other things go right as well, but I think what you say there in terms of, are they hitting the right target? That's the key. The schools are very good at getting students to university, but the schools now recognise their students can't thrive beyond university.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like, if I'm a hurdles coach and I do all this training and I get my athlete to the start line, I can either turn back before the gun's even fired, thinking I've gotten there, I've done my job. I can wait for the gun to fire, see them off the line and think, okay, time to go and train the next lot. Or I can kind of watch them get over the first hurdle and see how they've performed. Or I can watch the entire race and then go back and learn how to adapt my coaching strategies for training. I think schools generally are very much at the starting gun or the first hurdle. We don't have great longitudinal data on what happens to our students beyond university into the career that we can then use to inform practice. There isn't a great deal of that. We don't, even with really good alumni societies, we don't track that. So we don't really know whether we've really set them up to succeed or not. We know that we've got them through, and we measure ourselves, and did we get them through that first hurdle, the grades? And that might be the starting gun. We kind of watch that, we watch them a little bit, we may have some contact with some students in the early stages of university, and we might feed that into some of our planning. But fundamentally, we're driven by, can they react off a starting gun? Can they get into that university? Can they do that? Can they get the grades? So even in the UK, in some of the great boarding schools that got all resources and the time with students, academics, until very recently, has really dominated over anything to do with character, holistic impact education, measuring any of that. How many of our report systems really report on how a student performs in clubs? Just don't really do it. And yet, we're saying that communication with parents is so important, that, we work together. Well, prove it, And so I think it's not just a sort of criticism of the Japanese system. I think generally we don't look at things beyond. The problem is, in Japan, that university entrance exam system is just so powerful and competitive and so impactful in terms of what it means beyond, that as a parent, as a child, you risk everything. And that feeds down the system. So that their chances in that exam are driven by the high school they go to. Therefore, you do everything you can to get them into that high school. So what do you think the life of a 10, 11-year-old preparing for junior high school entrance exams is like?
Oh my God, yeah.
And so I have students on my course. One of our areas for them to look at is family. And one of the prompts I have for the reflection is to kind of get them to tell me about some of their sort of happiest memories with family. And the most common thing I hear is, when I was really young, we had a family day out too. But now that my sister is in high school, I've just done my junior high entrance exams, and my younger brother is in the elementary school system. We never have the time to go out. We're all at cram school, or we have to work at home. So that's kind of, for me, that's a really sad situation. And I think that's, part of this challenge and this problem, and how do you kind of go about resolving that? 1 hour a week of moral education to discuss some ethical issues is not changing that. But that's what people want to see the change in. Now, you do have some phenomenal examples of single schools. If you've never seen the TED Talk about Fuji Kindergarten, so it's about the architect Takaharu Tezuka, I think his name is. Just type in like kindergarten to TED and it'll soon come up. That kindergarten is the most incredible building and learning space I think I've ever seen. I've never been there. I was desperate to go and see it live. But that's phenomenal. And so you do have these kind of pockets of excellence. And, the consortium I work with, a lot of their students want to go and do medicine. So they've now got this kind of double helix translational medicine where they look at ethics. And they have UK doctors come over to talk and develop teamwork skills, ethical decision making, because they recognize that Our students don't value that because the entrance exams don't value that. They don't value moral education because the assessment doesn't value it. And that's fine if your assessment is not so dominating. But when your assessment model is so dominating, you don't give people the time and space.
Yeah. Even we found that, like, we were talking about being heads of sixth form, working with these students. And one of the things that let's say from my side of it, is like the heads of faculty will take care of academics. That's the way I see it. My role is about, and I'm a big fan of, is Michael Fullan's work here. Like loads of different schools. And you'll see 6 Cs, 4 Cs, 10 Cs, whatever it is. You know, everyone's got a different approach to it, but we've kind of focused in on his. And I was speaking with Leo Thompson about this a while ago on the podcast. It's kind of, he opened my eyes to it, but about citizenship and character. And I've taken that into the role with me. And I say to my students, it's like, when I write about you, I'm not going to write about, you know, how you've done in biology, or how you've done in psychology, you know, and a lot of the people who are asking me about you do not want to know about that. Guess what they want to know? Guess what they want to know about? They want to know about the type of person you are, your character, you know. And so those types of things, everything we're saying here is it's kind of like we already know it. The challenging part is, how do we develop those things in students? And obviously it sounds like the moral education framework they have is aimed at doing that. There's a setup to do that. Yeah. But as you say, it's one of those things that if done right, it could be done really well.
Well, I think particularly in international school context, but even outside of international school context, I think this is really important. In terms of understanding who you are, so much of who we are is influenced by sociogenic factors, cultural on different levels, family up to national level culture. And when we live and operate within a culture, there are loads of cultural reference points that we have a sort of shared understanding with others about, that we all understand certain, again, it comes back to this idea of stories and fables. There's certain ways of doing things and talking about things that we all share and understand. And that is what moral education in Japan in some ways is trying to achieve. It's trying to put these cultural reference points in place so there is this shared understanding that goes across generations, across all areas of the country, and provides a kind of a focal point for understanding what it means to be Japanese. In the international school environment, I think it's really powerful if schools can help the students in their school to understand the cultural reference points of their host country, first of all. But then, and this is where the reflection that is highly valued in moral education in Japan, reflection is really important, because you then want those students to be able to reflect upon the cultural reference points of a culture of their choice. That could be that they spent 3 years in Hong Kong before moving to Dubai. It could be that they've got 2 British parents. It could be that they've got parents of different nationalities and multiple nationalities influencing them as well. And so it might be one that they want to go. But the learning happens when there is this comparison between the two and that understanding. And that's the thing where I think when we think about character development, there's lots of stuff we can do. We're well versed in all the individual stuff around resilience and all that kind of stuff. But I think where it connects in with global education is really important, is we need to develop local identity, but with global purpose. And where you combine those two things and you have that understanding of what we mean by cultural reference points, and you have an appreciation of what it means to adopt an alternative culture, an alternative lens, and where you have that understanding of like the need for really deep reflection about who you are really, not just who you are on the face of it, but who you are really, like what has informed where you are right now, and how's that going to sort of influence where you go from here. Then I think that's a sort of a really powerful way in which we can embed all these different initiatives and not have these kind of like singular, we do moral education at this point, we do global education here, we do some character stuff here, we have an off timetable day to cover this, we have subjects doing this. But to me, that's what holistic impact education is it's bringing all that together, not doing all these things in isolation. And I think we talk about holistic education in Japan. I could find evidence where there's some clubs available for students. I can provide evidence where there's some global education happening. I can provide evidence of this and of that. But they're not together. They're not combined. And if teachers aren't able to really connect those, well, what hope have our children got? So that's where I sort of think about and reflect upon some of those things that you mentioned there.
Great points. Great points in terms of being what we call interdisciplinary versus siloed. I think that's one of the changing points we see through education, which is very well articulated by yourself there. I want to close, sort of come to an end with this one then. But one last question for you. So if you could leave our listeners with one key takeaway about the value of moral education in Japan, what would it be?
One key aspect of moral education, I think. So a couple of things I think that are done really well. I think the structure that is provided where students go from self to other to society and environment and surroundings is a good structure, which I think we do cover in other parts of the world, but I don't think we do it in a really sequential way. I think we kind of muddle it and pick and choose. And again, we don't have that solid understanding of who we are first. And then, okay, right, now let's think about this in relation to others and let's spiral that back and keep that kind of growth going. We don't do that in a particularly logical way. So I think that would be one of the things I would think about. I would... It's a good question. I would... I'd really like to see... I mentioned cultural reference points, actually. That would probably be it. So I think, actually, there's a lot of contention around some of the stories that have been chosen for the textbooks in Japan, particularly those that reference historical figures around the war and how the government has tried to revise that history. But I think those cultural reference points are extremely powerful in education, not just when you look at it from a macro perspective and a whole society's education, but actually when you think about it from an individual's education. And I think about that individual from the perspective of developing social and global mobility. So I think it is that understanding actually of the cultural reference points of how you are and why you are like you are because of others and those around you that I think enables key aspects of social and global mobility. And I think that's something that we don't do well generally across the world. That would probably be it, actually, now I think about it. Now I've been forced into it.
Twisted your arm there. It's interesting because as soon as you said that, and I'm going to try and make sure I tell the story, or at least as correctly as possible, so not cause any offense to anyone, but it reminds me of what I hear about German history being taught versus American history being taught. I don't know if you've come across this previously in terms of how Germany, when they talk about their history, and we know historically what happened in the atrocities. And you would think then as a country and as a culture, they would want to shy away from that and kind of redact a lot of the things. And it's the opposite. That in Germany, they go through this and they teach it so that the generations who are coming through are able to learn from those mistakes to ensure that then what they do for Germany and move on about being a global citizen is that we're fully aware of our country's history. We're fully aware of this. However, we're doing these things to be better, to develop. And that for me, really, when I spoke to people in Germany about this, I was like, that's actually very, really interesting and kind of goes to some of the things you said about global mobility, about context, about culture, about identity. And they compared it to then the American history about how they try and, block out and don't talk about slavery. And we're coming at this. I'm coming at this from an educational standpoint now. I'm not getting into the politics of it or anything else. Just to be very clear on that before. Yeah, but it's just from an educational system. You would think, again, I remember learning about this in the UK system about slavery and all these different things. I remember learning about World War II and Hitler in a UK system. And I find it then, as I say, when you're talking about Japan and the moral frameworks that they have there, that obviously the opinions on the war and everything that took place, is that these things are important to learn about your country's history, the good and the bad, so that you can make well-informed decisions moving forward to be better, to ensure that those mistakes aren't made again. And I think for me as character and as citizenship, those are, the important questions, the important stories to tell. Yes, they're going to be, they'll cause conflict, they'll cause division, they will cause, people with difference of opinions. However, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, I really echo that. The single most powerful moment I think I had as a kind of an educator, which really actually was one of the things that really accelerated my desire to go and look at all this aspect of education, was we had some survivors of the Bosnia-Herzegovina massacre, genocide, Srebrenica massacre. And they came into a talk at the school and they finished by saying, the reason why we go into schools is because these atrocities were committed by the most well-educated in our society, because they're the only people who can get into government positions. What does that tell you about education and what education needs? And that is so important. You can know everything. That's why, we have these ethics programs for doctors and medics, why we're looking at that and why, moral education is so valuable and important. One of the challenges, and I said assessment is weighted against that in Japan. We don't really assess and measure. So one of my sort of big projects at the moment is working with the Be World Class platform, which came off the back of a charity which accredited schools on world class characteristics. And now, because of AI developments in the last 12 months, we can now really measure quite effectively character education, character development, and instantly turn that into quantifiable, meaningful data for school leaders to make decisions about what they are doing, the impact of decisions that they've made on their children's character, where students can develop their independence by going through this kind of deep reflection, all these different areas supported by AI. But then that's feeding in millions of words of data, which no teacher could ever trawl through. But that can now be looked at. What used to be completely impossible to quantify can now be quantified. And I think that's the shift we now need to move in, is to now look at, why have we allowed academics to dominate? Because we can measure it easily and quantify it. Okay, how do we balance that? We need to look at how we really understand character development, and that needs to be measured so it becomes visible. And so that's why, that's I think the thing that I think will have a massive impact in the future, and change that whole, value that we associate with it in the eyes of it. We can talk about it, but it's the reality when you're busy of what do you do? What are your decisions as a child going through the Japanese education system?
Amazing. And I think a great way to end this. It's been a really, really insightful conversation, and I learned a lot from you, Charlie. So really, really appreciate you coming on and speaking to us and sharing that wealth of knowledge that you have, obviously about Japan. But I'm sure I could speak to you about numerous different countries as well, in terms of how versed you are and where you go to. If anyone does want to reach out, want to find out more about the type of work that you're doing and get into contact with you, where is the best place to find you?
LinkedIn's always good. Find on LinkedIn, or just email charlie@glocaleducate.com as well.
Yeah, well, type that one out, because we've
had that. Glocal's no good. Yeah. Typos don't like it, but it's important to me. Yeah.
Definitely. All right. Well, Charlie, we're going to let you go. This has been a fantastic conversation. Again, really, really appreciate you spending the time and sharing that wealth of knowledge about the Japanese culture, moral education, and just sort of the type of work that you're doing out there to empower character within, obviously, global students. Really, really appreciate it. So thank you ever so much.
Much appreciated, Alex. Thank you. A pleasure, and a really important topic. So thank you.